Bonjour tout le monde, bienvenue.
Welcome, everyone. I call this meeting to order.
Common Standing Committee on National Defense, and today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of September 23rd, 2020, and the proceedings will be made available during the House of Commons website. All right, the witnesses, if you will give us a couple of minutes to begin, we have a couple of small issues of committee business to deal with. Hopefully we'll keep them to a minimum. And then we'll start in with our witnesses. Committee business. There was a steering committee report that was circulated. We need a motion to approve that report. We did get suggestions of amendments, but it became clear that there were members who were reticent to accept the amendment. So I don't think there are any amendments. It's just the steering committee as it currently stands.
This will move the report as circulated.
All right, thank you. Mr. Bazan moves. I'll move the, and Mr. Baker too. Okay, good. Thank you. Two movers. That's perfect. All those in favor? Okay, all right. Thank you very much. So the so moved steering committee move has been adopted. Okay. We're good. We see an Isla. Okay. All right. So then that is the end of the committee business then. All right. Thank you, everyone. We will move on to our witnesses then today. Our witnesses today are Rear Admiral Genevieve Bernatchez, Judge Advocate General, and Colonel Jill Rye, Deputy Judge Advocate General, followed by Colonel Rakesh Jetley, Senior Psychiatrist and Director of Mental Health for the Canadian Forces Health Services Group, and then followed by Ms. Kindra Rotunda, Professor of Military and International Law at Chapman University. So I'll go to you first, Rear Admiral Bernatchez, for your opening statements.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will keep my opening remarks brief. Please allow me to begin by introducing myself. I am Rear Admiral Genevieve Bernatchez, the Judge Advocate General of the Canadian Armed Forces. I am the legal advisor to the Governor General, the Minister of National Defense, the Department of National Defense, and the Canadian Armed Forces in matters relating to military law. I am also legislatively entrusted with the superintendence of the administration of military justice in the Canadian Armed Forces. Je remercie le comité de nous avoir invités, mes collègues et moi, à venir.
I would like to thank the committee for inviting us to appear before the committee today. I have the pleasure of being accompanied by Colonel Rakesh Jetley, Senior Psychiatrist and Mental Health Advisor for the Canadian Armed Forces, and Colonel Jill Rye, Deputy Judge Advocate General for Military Justice.
People are at the core of everything the defense team does. The health and well-being of Canadian Armed Forces members, including their mental health, are therefore a high priority for defense. The care and support of our members are of paramount importance to the operational success of the Canadian Armed Forces. And the military justice system's purpose is to support the operational effectiveness of the Canadian Armed Forces. Indeed, as the Supreme Court of Canada reminded us last year in its landmark decision in R.V. Stillman, the military justice system is designed to meet the unique needs of the military. It does so through its very purpose, which is to assure the maintenance of discipline, efficiency, and morale of the Canadian Armed Forces. The military justice system therefore recognizes the importance of mental health and includes necessary safeguards to help protect individuals who suffer from a mental disorder. For example, an accused person must be fit to stand trial. An accused person cannot be dealt with by way of summary trial if they were suffering from a mental disorder at the time of the alleged offense. The defense of mental disorder is available, and all accused members have access free of charge to a defense counsel including full representation at court-martial. Last year, the Supreme Court of Canada also confirmed the constitutional legitimacy of the military justice system and affirmed that it is a full partner in administrating justice alongside the civilian justice system. This validation of the military justice system constitutional legitimacy comes as a result of the system's continued growth and evolution. The military justice system is enhanced through regular and periodic legislative developments, policy initiatives, external reviews, independent reviews mandated under the National Defense Act, such as the one appointed by the Minister of National Defense on 16 November of this year, judicial decisions, and importantly, continued parliamentary interest in its development. Pris ensemble, ces processus importants contribuent à
Together, these key processes contribute to the continued responsible evolution of Canada's military justice system, and this evolution is important, necessary, and positive. My team and I take the evolution of the military justice system very seriously to ensure that it continues to meet Canada's legal and societal norms and can ultimately serve its purpose of maintaining the discipline, efficiency, and morale of the Canadian Armed Forces. I understand that Colonel Jetley has some opening remarks for you as well, and I'd like to speak on behalf of the three of us by saying we are honored in appearing before the committee, and we are prepared to answer your questions at the end. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Please.
Thanks very much. Madam Chair and members of the Steering Committee on National Defense, I am the Chief of Psychiatry in CAF. I have several key roles, including advising leadership on mental health issues. I'm the Senior Mental Health Clinician of the CAF. I conduct and facilitate a great deal of mental health research related to military members and serve as the CAF representative on international committee meetings within NATO and beyond. I thank you for your interest in the well-being of the men and women of the Canadian Armed Forces, in particular their mental health. As we have learned through our high-quality research efforts, mental illness is common within the Canadian Armed Forces, just as it is in civilian society. Our studies, such as the 2002 and 2013 Canadian Community Health Survey Mental Health CF version, allowed us to understand the burden of mental illness within our organization compared to the civilian population. Our depression rates in both studies were higher than those in the civilian population, and our PTSD rates increased substantially between 2002 and 2013, not surprisingly after the conflicts in Afghanistan. For example, the 2013 survey found a 15.7 lifetime prevalence of depression in members of the CAF. Lifetime PTSD was estimated at 11.1%. Just as significant as these crude numbers, these studies also tell us a great deal about help seeking, perceived barriers to care, and help us to understand what we call the need-care gap. As we continue to evolve our programs, we are guided by these studies and science with an aim to provide CAF members with timely access to evidence-based care. The well-understood barriers to care include the fact that individuals are unaware that they have a mental illness that may be amenable to care. People also often prefer to handle things themselves. They fear for their careers. And of course, there is stigma. People may think that I'm weak if I go for mental health care. The programs that we have developed are specifically designed as countermeasures to these barriers of care. For example, Road to Mental Readiness aims to educate, teach coping skills, reduce stigma, and increase help seeking. The term OSI concretely legitimized psychological injury alongside physical injury. I understand that this committee is also interested in discussing suicide prevention within the CAF. Sadly, suicides do occur in our society, and the Canadian Armed Forces are not an exception. Depending on the source, but conservatively using Statistics Canada numbers, 11 Canadians die by suicide each day, which is approximately 4,000 per year. Within Canada, suicide is the second leading cause of death among the young and young adults aged 15 to 34 years, and 3 times higher in men and women. A third of deaths by suicide occur in those aged 45 to 59 years. A quick look at these numbers, and we see that the men and women of the Canadian Armed Forces are within these higher risk demographic. We have within Canadian Forces Health Services the commitment to better understanding of suicide, to better manage and mitigate risk. We are in regular communication with our allies and leverage the collective wisdom to implement approaches that we feel would be helpful. It is also important to remember that suicide is not a singularly health-related issue, as it is a complex, multifactorial condition that usually involves a mental health condition, diagnosed or not, stressor, which is usually an interpersonal stressor, certain personality factors or traits, such as impulsivity, and of course, access to lethal means. I can expand further as desired, but the model mentioned provides many opportunities for suicide intervention. As such, within the Canadian Armed Forces, we consider suicide prevention a collective responsibility that involves leadership, colleagues, peers, healthcare providers, and the entire community. In 2009 and 2016, we convened expert panels on suicide prevention, in which we invited academic and military experts from within Canada and our allies to help assess and guide our efforts in this important area. We have made recent changes that include working with the Canadian Psychiatric Association to create a CAF Clinician Handbook on Suicide Prevention that is a comprehensive document that identifies risk assessment and management of suicidality. We adopted the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale to standardize our capturing of elevated risk. We also introduced CBTS through a training program across the country, which is cognitive behavioral therapy specifically aimed to address suicidal behavior, not just the underlying mental health condition. In March of this year, we within the Canadian Armed Forces, as did all Canadians and indeed the world, faced an unprecedented stressor. The COVID-19 pandemic, which I know this committee has discussed, impacted us all. From a mental health care perspective, I would like to share the fact that the mental health services were never closed, in that from the outset, our leadership considered the mental health care of members of the Canadian Armed Forces a priority. We faced challenges, as all health systems did. We had to comply with local, municipal, and provincial policies and had to manage risk to our patients and staff vis-a-vis the pandemic. Services continued and continue to be provided. Mental health care has been provided across the country in our clinics using a variety of means ranging from in-person assessments with both patient and clinician appropriately wearing PPE, telephonically, and virtually using video platforms. There have been challenges along the way in this implementation based on technology such as limited Wi-Fi in some of our buildings and the compatibility of commercial platforms. This is an area we will continue to refine. We can discuss further as desired, but as someone who joined the Canadian Armed Forces at the end of the Cold War, I am one that remembers that health services exist not only to provide care to the ill and the injured, but also to maintain the operational readiness for times when we are expected to respond and act on behalf of the people of Canada. During this panic, the CAF did respond both domestically and internationally when called upon, and health services supported those on operations. I'm happy now to take any questions along with my colleagues that the committee may have, and to let you all know that this will be the last time you'll be meeting me in uniform, as I am well into my transition back to civilian society at the beginning of 2021 after 31 years of service. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Colonel Jetley, and thank you very much for your service. I know we've done a lot of important work over your career. I'd now like to call upon Miss Kendra Rotunda.
Yes, good morning and congratulations, Colonel Jetley, on your retirement. It's fantastic. Thank you for inviting me to comment on Bill C-203, which would amend Section 98 of Canada's National Defence Act by repealing the self-harm element of the malingering charge. This would preclude Canada's military from punishing service members who harm themselves to avoid military duty. I'm a professor at Chapman University in Orange, California. I'm also a former Army JAG officer, and I currently direct Chapman's Military and Veterans Law Institute, in which law students and recent law school graduates working under my supervision represent veterans and service members in all types of legal matters. I previously co-authored a short article with a colleague, Ari Freilich, entitled Self-Inflicted Wounds, how military regulations prejudice service members, which is what prompted an invitation to appear at this hearing. Unfortunately, Mr. Freilich was not able to appear. He had an immovable conflict, but I have incorporated his feedback into my remarks as well. So turning to the issue, on one hand, we can certainly understand why a nation's military would be tempted to criminalize self-harm, especially on the eve of battle. Nobody, even the most disciplined and well-trained soldiers, will calmly run toward the jaws of death. So we know that it takes incredible will and incredible bravery to resist that natural flight instinct. Some may conclude, in fact, that death at their own hands or injury at their own hands on their own terms is better than death or injury by an enemy. On the other hand, though, criminalizing self-harm hurts the most vulnerable among our troops. This is especially true as our understanding of post-traumatic stress disorder evolves and our military suicide rate steeply and continuously climbs. I've learned through my 20 years of practicing military and veterans law, which entailed 6 years on active duty, that convictions for the crime of malingering result in immeasurable, permanent harm and suffering to our troops. It shames service members. It causes them to hide their distress. It pushes them ever deeper into depression and closer towards suicide, ironically. In shame, they avoid getting the help that they need. It's no wonder that the United States faces a suicide epidemic among our troops. Last month, USA Today reported that the suicide rate among our troops was at a 6-year high at 25.9 per 100,000 troops. I've read that Canada has similar statistics, with more Canadian troops dying by suicide in a 10-year period than the number of troops killed in Afghanistan over a similar 13-year period. Oh, now I wanted to turn to just a few examples. Over the life of our clinic, we've encountered several cases that involve service members who had been severely punished for attempting suicide. Several years ago, we encountered a case of a decorated combat veteran who was tasked with defusing IEDs over multiple war tours. He was medicated and diagnosed with PTSD. While deployed and barely holding it together, he was stop-lossed, which meant that he was not able to return home on schedule. In distress, he shot himself in the chest. He readily conceded under hostile questioning from his command while he was hospitalized in the psychiatric facility that he, quote, had wanted to die because he could not go back to combat, unquote. His command never disputed that the suicide attempt was genuine, but they nonetheless saw his statement about not being able to go back to combat as admission of a crime. They saw no difference between him wanting to die because of his PTSD and a malingerer's fraudulent intent to preserve their own life at military expense. As we argued in our law review article, other prohibitions on fraud or duty shirking are already more sufficient to deter and penalize genuine malingering. But given the still widespread misunderstanding and stigma around mental health injury and suicide, commands frankly too often interpret any offense whose essential element is self-injury as a license to punish and punitively discharge suicidal troops, which deters help seeking, especially without clear due process protections to prevent punitive treatment of people whose conduct is at least substantially motivated by mental injury or disease, whether diagnosed or not, prior to the attempt. Another one of our clients, a decorated 21-year-old combat veteran, was heavily medicated for diagnosed mental injuries with gash wrists covered in scars and held together by 4 staples when his team leader appeared in his psychiatric ward hospital room to threaten him with court-martial for, quote, attempting to injure or kill himself. He was hospitalized in an Army psychiatric hospital for 5 weeks before he received a stigmatizing misconduct discharge for cutting his wrist with a razor. He had no disciplinary record whatsoever. He was soon diagnosed with severe PTSD, and he nearly died of a second attempt when his brother discovered him hanging from a rope. Criminalizing suicide in the military is at odds with jurisprudence applied in the civilian sector. So, most American civilian jurisdictions decriminalize attempted suicide by the end of the horse and buggy era. Over 50 years ago, drafters of the Model Penal Code wrote, quote, "We think it is clear that attempted suicide is not an area in which penal law can be effective and that its intrusion on such tragedies is an abuse." The drafters also rejected the criminalization of non-suicidal self-injury. No American jurisdiction has criminally punished a suicide attempt since 1961. The California Supreme Court wrote 30 years ago that all modern research points to one conclusion about the problem of suicide: the irrelevance of criminal law to its solution. The Federal Ninth Circuit has agreed, saying that there is a modern consensus in this area of law. Despite being out of step with modern law, the military nonetheless still punishes suicide attempts by its military troops. Not surprisingly, the US military suicide and self harm rate only continues to increase despite these punitive responses to self harm. And this also causes collateral damage under our system when there's a denial of benefits, of VA benefits for those who need them the most. So most of the clients we represent in our institute are seeking an upgrade to their discharge level. This is because the Veterans Administration conditions most benefits on having an honorable or a general level discharge. The VA offers all kinds of robust benefits, including educational benefits, which fund college tuition, books, fees, and even a living stipend for veterans who are going to college full time. But however, in order to receive these benefits, service members must have separated with a higher level discharge. So even a minor infraction can result in a general level and disqualify the service member from the educational benefit that's offered in the United States. Service members who stand to benefit the most from that benefit are those with combat-related military occupational specialties, those who manned a weapon, those who served in the special forces, were ordnance experts, and the like. These dangerous soldiering jobs have no civilian equivalent. So those needing educational benefits the most are those who saw the most combat and those who are most likely suffering with PTSD and disciplinary infractions that seem to go hand in hand, frankly, with the PTSD diagnosis, often unfortunately including malingering. So for the above stated reasons, I support Canada's proposal to repeal the self-harm provision from the definition of malingering, and I'm happy to provide any additional information as requested or to answer any questions. And I thank you again for the opportunity to testify on this important matter.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Rotunda. Much appreciated. We'll go into the rounds of questions now, and we'll start with Mr. Benson, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here today, and thank you to all our all our military personnel for all your service to Canada. Thank you very much. Admiral Bernacchi, in thinking about Section 98C, and it seems to me that we should maybe break it up into two parts. And part one would be, pre-deployment, pre-battle, where someone inflicts some self-harm on themselves, that they are charged with a criminal act because you're trying to avoid duty. And then the second part would be after deployment, after they've been in a battle, after they've seen the horror and the carnage of battle. And they are now at a point where they are suffering a mental health issue. And at that point, maybe they inflict self-harm on themselves. And I don't think that those two things are equivalent. I think there's one trying to avoid duty, and one now is a complication from being in battle. Can you give your thoughts on how Section 98C maybe should be revised and we can look at this differently?
Yes, thank you for the question. So the first thing that I want to do is to acknowledge the interest and the concerns that are being expressed. and that the committee has heard. And certainly, the information that I want to provide to the committee is truly to inform the committee's understanding of the law and to be as clear as possible. So the first thing that I would like to specify here is that Section 98C of the National Defense Act uh, addresses situation where a member deliberately causes to themselves injury with the very specific intent to avoid service. And classical examples that we can all be familiar with would be a soldier who shoots themselves in the foot or cuts a finger in order to specifically not be sent to the front. And that's how the Canadian military law jurisprudence has been dealing with this section of the National Defense Act. So, contrary to my understanding, at least, and I would certainly leave it to Professor Rotunda to comment, contrary to the Uniform Code of Military Justice, which does not require proof of an intention to avoid service, our Code of Service Discipline, specifically in 98C, requires that element. Um, I would also like to say that certainly there has been a recognition by different allies of the requirement to address these circumstances in order to ensure that their force will be ready, available to fight, or to come to the assistance of their population in times of needs. The US, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Denmark, Spain, Italy, Germany, France, to name but a few, have very comparable provisions in their own code of service discipline. What I think that could help here is not perhaps to entirely get and to get to get away from a 98C and what it seeks to address, but perhaps, as is done for other offenses in the Code of Service Discipline, insert a note in the Queen Regulations and Order that would specifically indicate the intent. And I'm thinking here at something that could read like attempts to die by suicide or when self-harm committed for a purpose other than avoiding service is not covered by this offense. So this way clearly indicates the intent of the legislator, clearly indicates what this section is not meant to address, and could appease some of the concerns, I think.
Oh, that's excellent. I think that would be very, very helpful in making it very clear so that the stigma of a suicide, especially after the battle, is not, there's a worry that people won't come forth for mental health help. And I think that if we remove that part of that stigma, which is they're going to be charged with a criminal offense with the very high penalties, they may be more likely to come forward and do that. So thank you for that answer. Professor Rotunda, in the States, you talk about the military having a category of self-harm without the intent to avoid service. Is that working? And is that used a lot in the United States? Is it working? And is it allowing more people to come forward and get mental health help?
Well, so first off, under our article, so malingering is Article 83 of our UCMJ, and it does include a provision of any person subject to this chapter who, with the intent to avoid work, duty, or service, feigns illness, dismemberment, etc., or intentionally inflicts self-harm. So it does actually have intent. It's not as clearly spelled out as the Canadian law, but it does have that. One thing that we have found is that commanders, when they're wanting to punish a service member, quite easily satisfy themselves that the person was intending to avoid work. You know, the example that we have of a service member who, through pain, uh, after suffering a suicide attempt, admits, I can't go back to battle. And that's a very different thing than, I'm afraid to I'm afraid to go to this training. I do think that the notion was expressed a moment ago of being able to parse out those instances where someone is healthy, able, and well, but scared, like we all would be, right? And harms themselves, being able to parse those out from those individuals who are severely just suffering with mental disease. And I'm not sure that you had mentioned the notion of maybe having pre-deployment versus post-deployment analysis. So if someone hurts themselves pre-deployment before they've been to war versus someone who's hurts themselves post-deployment, I think that's possibly a good way, to get at the issue. The only thing is you'd want to be very careful about how you spell that out, because we have in our military anyway several people who come to military service, frankly, who've had violence in their past, who come, with a lot that could be coming to military service with PTSD. So while I think that's a step in the right direction, and I really applaud Canada truly for looking at this and really trying to get to how you might amend the statute in a way that could get to what we are trying to get at. So there are some instances, I think, where malingering does need to be punishable. We can't allow people to drop a brick on their foot intentionally the night before the ruck march because they
Right.
don't want to go.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I answered your question. I'm happy to
No,
further.
no, I think you
Thank you.
did. I think you enlightened us a little bit more and moving us in the right direction. So thank
All
you.
right. Thank you very much. On to Mr. Baker, please.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente. Merci.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. My question is directed to the Rear Admiral. What is Canada's record in terms of charging soldiers under Section 98C? Thank you for the question. I could ask my colleague Colonel Wright to provide specific statistics. In the meantime, our research from the last months has shown that it has been used most frequently during the Second World War. It was used over 300 times during the Second World War. So it seemed that at that time there was a definite need for this charge. But since 2000, there are only 2 charges have been laid on under 98C. So only 2 charges, one of which resulted in a declaration of culpability and the other one which was dropped. But perhaps my colleague Colonel Wright has further information.
Committee for the question. It is correct that since 2000, there have been 2 members who have been charged under Section 98C, and one charge was a finding of the matter was not proceeded with, and only in the second one was the individual proceeded to trial by summary trial and found guilty. I will say from a bit of research into the details of that particular finding of guilty, the situation was not one where mental health was an issue. It was a situation where someone was on exercises and admitted at the time to taking particular action in order to be returned back to his home base and to not have to continue in those exercises. So that is our history in the last since 2000, with only 2 members being charged under Section 98C. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Et
thank you for that. And the member of the armed forces that was found guilty, was he or she punished, and what was their sentence? I do not believe we have that information, but we can obtain it and provide it later on in writing. That would be fine, thank you. Let's turn to other countries now, especially Western European countries and the United States. Do they have a similar section? Section similar to 98C? Yes, as mentioned earlier, the United States, Great Britain, Australia, New Zealand, Denmark, Spain, and Italy, Germany, France, and others have similar sections and provide about the same conditions, terms and conditions, and they all seek to avoid a scenario where a person called to serve, to defend their country or to support the civilian population, shirk duty by self-harming, deliberately self-harming. I could describe what each of these countries' sections and penalties include, but that would take a long time. But if you like, I can submit this information in writing. It's a table summarizing the results of our research and summarizing the different sections for the different countries. That would be great. Thank you. Now, very briefly, because I know time is running out. In your opinion, what is the impact of a section such as 98C on a soldier's motivation to seek help when they're thinking about suicide? I think this question would be better answered by my colleague, Jetley, because she is, Colonel Jetley is responsible for this.
It's an excellent question, because in the sense of, the answer really is in 30 years of working in mental health, specifically in the last 20 years, sadly being involved in, virtually every suicide investigation that we've had in the CAF, certainly in the last 10 years, I've never truly seen this specifically stated by a patient or by their family as a reason for the person not coming. But again, you can never disprove a negative. That's a scientific impossibility. I believe there are barriers to care. I think I mentioned them. Barriers to care include stigma, include not being aware I have a mental illness. I'm 40 years old, I'm dragging ass. Maybe it's depression, maybe it's not, this kind of idea. And certainly concerns about one's career is a very valid, and comes across all of our allies. So will I be, and I'm not going to be punished. We don't never specifically ask, I'm afraid of being punished, but it's if I come forward with a mental illness or any kind of health illness, will it impact my deployability, universality of service? So I do not have any knowledge at all about 98C specifically in the Canadian Armed Forces that I've ever heard from a patient or a colleague. I'm sort of the senior person. If it was coming up within our contractors, our uniformed, I probably would have heard of it. But again, that does not disprove a negative. But of course, people's concerns for their career is a valid barrier to care.
Right.
Merci
Thank
beaucoup.
you very much. On to Monsieur Brunel-Duceppe, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Je remercie.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to thank all the witnesses for their presence and their service in the armed forces. My first question is directed to all witnesses. We have an action plan for suicide prevention within the armed forces, and it says that any previous suicide attempts are a predictor for future suicide attempts. And it said that self-harm also is a factor in increased risk for suicidal behaviors. So I was wondering if the armed forces has data on suicide attempts or self-harm, and if so, how is this data being used to inform policies?
I'll start with that. It's a very the whole science of intent to ideation to attempt, serious attempt, not serious attempt, quote unquote, and then the actual suicide act is a little bit. There's some debate in academia as to how somebody transitions through it, or are there difference between serial attempters versus completers, and I think that's the key. You can never really get a good and reliable number of attempts, and that's something that I've educated, I've attempted to sort of speak to your predecessors before, because if somebody takes an overdose and wakes on a Friday, wakes up on a Saturday, and carries on with the day, we'll never know about that.
Oh,
So what we have in place is we have a reporting sort of policy, in that if the chain of command, if somebody becomes aware of a suicide attempt, there's a form that's filled, we collect the information, and the communication between leadership and the senior medical authority on the ground is to ensure that the person is in care, right? I mean, so the ultimate between chain of command and the senior medical authority, we'll call it a base surgeon for my sort of Army background, will communicate, because sometimes the boss knows or the MPs might find somebody. You got to make sure the doctor knows. So just make sure they're on the same page. That's sent up to our headquarters. Within our directorate, we sort of track those. We do have the numbers, and I believe in a separate filing, we've produced that document. So I don't have it right now, but it's coming to you folks. But I think our emphasis is ultimately on getting the person into care. The cognitive behavioral therapy suicide, the CBTS specific treatment that we've implemented in the last few years with training across the country in both official languages, is to do a pivot to follow academia, in the sense of most of my career sort of growing up. If somebody's depressed and they're suicidal, you treat the depression as hard as you can to try to make the depression better. But CBTS, cognitive behavioral therapy S for suicide, helps you to target suicidal behavior, specifically giving person the safety, the skills, the safeguards to try to prevent it. So the suicide attempt approach really comes down in our medical system to ensure that the chain of command knows what resources are available for their people, and our clinicians in a one-to-one basis help somebody to have the skills to attempt to do alternate coping other than self-harm.
Merci beaucoup pour cette réponse, ma foi, très détaillée.
Thank you for this very detailed response. And while I'm at it, I would like to wish you a very happy retirement, Colonel Jetley. I have another question for you. Major Caroline Martin testified last October and works at the mental health services of the Canadian Armed Forces. In her testimony, she said that whereas we were starting to work in long-term care centers, we recognized that there was a heightened risk of long-term mental health disorders for clinicians. Do you share that concern? And could you elaborate on that and the measures to take?
I absolutely share the concerns. We are asking our soldiers to do some things, and service members in general to go into sort of unfamiliar ground, and somebody that has been around long enough. I was in Rwanda a few years ago, and you see a lot of death, a lot of suffering in places like this. So two-pronged approach. Road to mental readiness, education, training, self-care, coping was given to the people sort of before and after the deployment. So people have the tools, they know what resources are available. And that's been, I think you heard from Lieutenant Colonel Bailey, my colleague, who's sort of been in the next office to me for about a decade. And so a great program that, many of our allies are sort of borrowing as well. On the other hand, my curiosity hat, a few of us got together very opportunistically and thought that this would be a very important topic to study. So what we have started is what we call a mixed methods longitudinal study to study the impact of this, call it a deployment in quotes, So we are doing surveys, questionnaires, as well as interviews to kind of see the impact. And to be honest with you, as a clinician scientist, I'm very curious because I could see some young soldiers perhaps saying, you know, what the hell are we doing? You know, this kind of a deployment. This isn't what I signed up for. On the other hand, somebody else might say it's really nice to help people in my own country instead of 7,000 miles away. So we have this curiosity, which is surveying and questionnaires and interviewing to see the mental health impact, to look to see whether people felt well prepared about the training, which will sort of feed back to leadership as well. And we're also looking at the concept of moral injury, whether seeing the death and dying and the suffering and the helplessness leads to sort of guilt, shame, and other sort of components. So two-pronged, absolutely looking after them in the best way we can from a practical point of view, but also curious and learning, because I think many of us feel that, you know, domestic operations like this are going to carry on. So to do research, to continue as a learning organization, to feed back our findings is the other thing we're doing.
All right. Thank you very much. Mr.
Merci beaucoup.
McGregor, please.
Durian.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. I'm here on behalf of my colleague, Mr. Randall Garrison, today. So, on his behalf, I wanted to go along the line of, you know, why exactly we still have Section 98C in the Act. I mean, our witnesses clearly identified the fact that I believe only 2 cases were prosecuted in the last 20 years. And you know, if it's setting the wrong tone by treating self-harm as a disciplinary matter rather than a mental health concern, and I realize mental health issues are very complex and there's a very wide spectrum. You know, maybe our witnesses can inform the committee. You know, has there just been a general reluctance to engage with Section 98C? Anything you can provide that would illuminate us on that? Thank you.
Thank you. Perhaps I can start answering the question, and then my colleague, Colonel Arai, could provide other information. I think that the use of 98C since 2000 only 2 times, it's always very difficult in any justice system to explain why a particular section is used or not used. For example, in the military justice system, we know that approximately 70% of the charges being laid all pertain to the same type of categories. So they are there to address circumstances that prevail at the time at which they are used. So perhaps, and this is only speculative, but perhaps it has acted as a dissuasive 98C for those who specifically intended to injure themselves to escape service, not to do it because they knew that the offense was on the books. I don't know that, but I'm just offering that as a possibility. Um, the other thing that I can point to is that before Section 98C is used, like most offenses, there will be a whole of command approach to advising those who would lay the charges and would dispose of the charges. So the commanding officer would be consulting with his medical officer in such circumstances. So is the person identified as a person that is not apt to stand trial or is suffering from a mental injury. Um, they will also receive legal advice from their legal advisor. So, is it appropriate or not to charge under this specific section of the National Defense Act? This is something that the charge layer would have to be advised of. So there would be a consultation that would be advised that would be provided to the charge layer to ensure that there's not an inappropriate use of that charge. Perhaps my colleague could provide further information.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, committee. The only thing I would just add is it's important to remember that the purpose of the Code of Service Discipline and the military justice system, of course, is to advance and support the discipline, morale, and efficiency for the Canadian forces. And part of the way that it does that is through the processes that it brings forward to both deter activities and conduct that will take away from the discipline, efficiency, and morale, and also provide a mechanism by which to enforce those offenses and enable that conduct. So it's important to see that 98C is part of a larger mosaic of service offenses that exist under the military justice system to serve to deter conduct and behavior that would diminish the efficiency and discipline and morale of the Canadian forces.
Thank you. And maybe just talking about that mosaic, Colonel Jetley, you talked a little bit about this in your opening statement. What's the current state of mental health resources in the Canadian Armed Forces? What's the current state of waiting lists, and are there any vacant positions that are still like a part of the problem? Because we do have some statistics about the extra demands that there are and long wait times.
Yeah, the staffing, and again, I will sort of commit to providing sort of the numbers in terms of specific staffing. The last I checked, we're about 90% of all of our positions filled, and that's sort of been steady state for the last few years. A lot of it is sort of a normal attrition. Often we have challenges where a lot of the clinicians, the civilian clinicians that work, are actually often spouses of military members that get posted and moved around. That becomes part of the issue. Mental health professionals are also in high demand. In terms of mental health providers to sort of service members ratio, we have one of the highest in NATO. So we have sort of, we are sort of lucky to be well resourced in those ways. Wait lists are something that we're always tracking, and we're always looking for sort of more efficiencies. The way that we address that, we have regular receipt of wait lists. We have sort of our benchmarks, which are, it's difficult because there aren't really good civilian benchmarks for wait lists for mental health, as opposed to some of the knee and hip surgeries and things. But if people are outside of our guidelines, we sort of work with the base in terms of identifying the reasons, the solutions. We do have, which I'm hoping, a silver lining to the COVID is the increased comfort and use with telepsychiatry and telemedicine, because certainly a more distressed base can have access from other bases. And there's a good use of this sort of in the triangle between Esquimalt, Vancouver, and Comox, the triangle in BC, where having psychiatry or psychology reach out to the other bases and avoid traveling. I think we're hoping for one of that to sort of even the playing field, because we have bases in very, very isolated places, and we have bases like Halifax, within walking distance from a university center. So it's an ongoing thing, ongoing tracking, ongoing challenge. And, we're far from in crisis mode right now, but we're in a steady state. And, we could always strive to be better, though.
Thank you.
But I'll give you the specific numbers in terms of HR.
Thank you. And allow me to say thank you for your service,
Okay.
and congratulations on your retirement.
Appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Can I just offer something quickly on that question?
Yes, go ahead, Professor.
Thank you. I just wanted to jump in on one point, which is that how many malingering cases there are. It's often not a perfect gauge to say, well, how many reported cases were there. The reason I say that is because when I've shepherdized our section as well, I only get a handful of cases that actually went all the way through the military justice system. And what we see in our clinic is that quite a few of the cases that we see, in fact, the majority of them, are people that did not go through a criminal process, but went through an administrative process where they were separated with a lower level discharge, and the reasoning being this malingering, as attempted suicide charged as malingering. And so those never come up through the system. So on our side, if you were simply just to look at the number of reported cases we have, that's not really representative of the problem that we have, because so much of it is happening at a lower level. And our service members then cannot get some of the benefits that they need at the VA. I'm not sure how that works at Canada, so I just offer that for what it's worth as you evaluate the extent of the situation in Canada.
Great. Thank you very much, Professor. And we're on now to Mr. Dowdle, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I too want to thank the witnesses today for coming back once again. Thank you very much, and certainly for your years of service. My question will be for Colonel Jetley, and I want to thank you and congratulate you. That's fantastic. I'm sure you're quite excited to move on to that next stage in life. Basically, we did a report in 2016, a mental health expert panel on suicide prevention and joint suicide prevention strategy highlighted that for some of our members that the transition period between being released from the Canadian Armed Forces and becoming a veteran can be particularly stressful and is a vulnerable time. And my riding here is I'm in Simcoe Grey, which has one of the largest, if not the largest base, which is CFB Borden. And what we find is that many of the individuals decide after their post-career to stay in Wasaga Beach or Alliston or Angus or some of the other local areas here, and which is good. And we certainly want to find a way that they can seamlessly integrate into our community here. And I've heard many times throughout the years that they seem to lack that 24/7 in-person support close here. I know that if you have stress or mental issues, for instance, I know that they have numbers and that they have to go to Toronto. But driving in Toronto, if you weren't stressed before, you will definitely be stressed by the time you get there. So my question to you is, and what we've heard of and talked of before in this series, do you think it would be a good idea to reach out? I know we're doing a hospital expansion down here in Alliston, which is borders right on, to work together to put some of those services close so that they're still here in the communities that they're at to hopefully help them through that stressful time, because I know they're also stressed as well with the backlog in Veterans Affairs. So I think if there's anything we can do to help them out, I think that's our duty.
It's a very multi-pronged question, and it's interesting because I did spend my first 4 years in Borden, so I know Alliston, Angus, Barrie, the whole area, and a lot of pleasant memories in that area. The transition, I think we are learning more and more as our allies are about transition. And one thing that I've been sort of speaking about a lot, and my colleagues, is the concept of transitions in a plural sense, right? So Borden is a training base, and many people come in from civilian society, and that harsh transition into the military. They've just finished basic training, they're away from family, and they're doing sort of they're learning their skills, their trades. The first year, so that the first couple of years, so we do have suicides, we have self-harm in our officer cadets and our young soldiers that are starting off. The transition coming back from deployment, that first year after deployment, is also a time of elevated risk of family difficulties, self-harm, mental illness. So that's why we have the screening, the reintegration. We've changed the way people come home from deployment. Then, of course, yes, the transition out from the forces. It's a stressful time regardless. It's a difficult time regardless. You've got to get provincial health cards again. You've got to do all kinds of things that you haven't done before. Find a family doctor, which is also stressful. And then if you add mental illness to that at a medical release, you've sort of either further. In terms of the healthcare provided in local hospitals, I think it's Stevenson Memorial, if I remember correctly.
Stevenson is the one they're actually going through a redevelopment.
Yeah.
So there's been discussions of perhaps working together. It would be good money well invested, where perhaps that we could save some money and at the same time hopefully save some lives.
So the idea of us, and again, this is the difference between the Canada and the US, is our healthcare, the provision of healthcare for our forces, by definition, is in partnership with the civilian health system. We do it via Blue Cross and federal funding, but we do not have hospitals anymore. We don't have 24/7. When I started, we did. We don't do our own surgeries in the sense of that. So we are always in a partnership, and really, it's the local senior medical authorities develop those relationships, like the base in Fredericton develops the relationship with the local hospital in Fredericton, and those types of things. So, what I would encourage there is literally the discussion at the lowest level in terms of defining needs. And I cannot speak for the Surgeon General, for the CMP, CDS, but by definition, everywhere in the country, we would not be able to look after our members without the civilian partnership. So it certainly is in principle something worth exploring.
And do you think there is a gap, or like there's a perception of gap? Do you actually think there's a gap in access to services during this transition period?
Well, I don't know about necessarily. I think there's always a potential gap in the sense that people may have health needs 24/7, and our clinics are now sort of ambulatory care. We're sort of daytime. We're not open on weekends typically. Those types of things. So After hours, there certainly is, we rely on the civilian system almost exclusively across the country in terms of emergency rooms and things like that. So there's certainly a potential need.
And do you think, one last question, do you think it would be good to have one single easy phone number like 988 to phone in when people are stressed? I know you have everyone has their own little organization,
Yeah.
but do you not think in people when they're totally stressed, do you not think that makes a lot of sense?
I'm a complete believer in leveraging technology, and I think the simpler we make things for people, the better. Yes.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Monsieur Robillard, s'il vous plaît.
Bonjour. Good afternoon or good day to the witnesses, and thank you for your appearances. I have quite a few questions. Firstly, to Colonel Jetley. Could you talk to us about the suicide prevention strategies between the Canadian Forces and the former Veteran Affairs Canada, which was adopted in 2017?
Speak about it. I think if I can speak historically, one of the things, and your colleague that asked the previous question, I think set this up nicely, is why it is now a joint strategy is because of the absolute recognition that a particularly high risk is transition. And there's a huge difference in the Canadian Armed Forces. We are in a very, very controlled, well-resourced. We have colleagues. We have a chain of command. We have a health system where everybody has primary care, and that transition to the civilian world. So the idea is to sort of have that sort of seamless handoff between the two government departments. There are many, many, many items within that, and they deal with sort of, as I mentioned earlier, suicide is a complex factor. So it has to do with structure, it has to do with vocation, it has to do with health, it has to do with moving, it has to do with settlement. But the idea is we've recognized the fact that moving itself can be stressful. Stressors can increase suicidality, particularly if people are ill. A small but significant part of it is related to health services. And what we have done is we've endeavored to sort of improve the handover of people, particularly with identifying illness, to Veterans Affairs Canada, where early in my career.
Thank you. How do the Canadian Forces support their members who have, in fact, made suicide attempts or who self-harm?
From a I'll say Canadian Armed Forces, I can start with health services. I mean, things in terms of health services, a suicide attempt or a self-harm attempt begins with a careful assessment to identify what illness is perhaps causing it. And there's illnesses like major depressive disorder, there's illnesses like post-traumatic disorder, which, to lay people may be similar, but they're quite different. And then we apply the evidence-based treatment. The entire focus there, I think it's very interesting. In the military, we grow up with, we put our careers and the organization first, we put our families second, then we usually put ourselves third. And what we demand of the person at this time is to turn that completely upside down, focus on themselves for self-care. The leadership has been, in my mind, almost always supportive. We put themselves in front, put their families second, and their career sort of, and their mission sort of behind, and focus on the care. And we attempt to provide the evidence-based care, whether it's psychotherapy, medication, whatever is needed, vocational rehab, retraining, with an aim. Number one aim is to get people better. Number two aim is to help keep their careers and help keep them in the Canadian Armed Forces if that's what they desire. And if not, make sure that there's a smooth transition to Veterans Affairs, of course, if they're eligible, but otherwise to the civilian system.
Quel est le taux actuel? What's the actual PTSD rate in the Canadian Forces currently? What percentage?
The numbers are always tricky. Actual percentage, if you want to look at a population-based, the last population-based survey we did in 2013, and the lifetime prevalence, I think I read it was 11%. and 11.1%, that's a lifetime prevalence. It doesn't talk about cause, doesn't say it's because of Afghanistan. It could be childhood, as one of our previous witnesses said. I believe, and I can be corrected later on, I believe that the 12-month prevalence was just about 5%, which was about double what it was in the 2002 survey. So so we always talk and remember that that depression has and always will be in armed forces, even at times of war, will be, just like in civilian society, the number one mental health condition, the most prevalent and the largest burden. PTSD varies from time to time with trauma. Our military members in most of our countries, Canada, US, have a higher propensity of adverse childhood events when they're growing up. It's the type of people we attract as well. So PTSD lifetime doesn't necessarily relate to military operations, although certainly military operations are a big part of it.
Merci. Right. Thank you very much, Monsieur.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chair. My question will be addressed to Colonel Jetley. A study was published by BNC in Journal of Psychiatry as to the efficiency of the strategies used for mental health in the forces. There didn't seem to be mixed results, if you will. Overall, the conclusions of the report were not necessarily wholly positive as to the results of your program. Could you perhaps talk to us a bit about this study and strategy and give us a few highlights?
In terms of what was the paper? What paper are you referring to?
C'est une étude qui a été publiée.
A study published by BMC Psychiatry. They examined the strategy that you use in the Canadian Forces. That the program didn't have the desired outcome. Oh, I'm afraid I don't have the name of the authors. I can probably send you that though. But I'd like.
It's hard to comment on a specific paper who the authors are, the methodologies. But in general, what I can say about psychiatric care overall is, civilian world, military world, it's we have a long way to go. I think our evidence-based treatments, if we're lucky, whether it's civilian depression, PTSD, help 50-60% of people, a significant number of people don't benefit. So I don't know if that's a specific military thing. We do have evidence that combat-related PTSD tends to respond less often. That's whether you're talking Australia, Canada, US, than civilian PTSD with the proper evidence-based treatments. So absolutely 100% concede more treatments, better treatments are needed, which is why the importance of continuing to do research and continue to find novel treatments. I can't specifically comment on this paper.
Oh, I fully understand. I do understand. But I think that on the road to mental health, I think was a specific program, and I would be interesting. Road to mental readiness.
Treatment program. So road to mental readiness. So Lieutenant Colonel Stan Bailey, who was last week, runs it. So thank you for clarifying that. So the R2MR is like many countries, our allies have sort of education programs to help destigma, to teach skills, to teach mindfulness, and we start that in basic training when people first come in to teach them mental health literacy, teach them the language, understand to take a knee if they're not feeling well, and to sort of maybe even be kinder to each other. And so that's part of the training and education program. So the efficacy of a training program is different than the efficacy of a treatment program. So
Je comprends. Mais si vous aviez, est-ce que vous connaissez bien ce programme-là? Ah, c'est déjà fini. Merde.
Oui.
Okay, merci.
Mr. McGregor, please.
Yes, thank you so much, Chair. When untreated, mental health issues understandably have a really big impact on the military families. We heard testimony at a previous meeting about the increasing challenges that military family resource centers face, given the spillover of mental health issues on families. The testimony was talking about the problems at CFB Esquimalt, especially for after hours care. And if someone's in a crisis at that time, they've got the chaplain team and the military police. Have the military family resource centers received any extra help? Have they been consulted? Because they are independent nonprofits, but they get almost all of their money from DND. So just any comment you can offer on that, please.
I can't comment or give you an answer specifically to that because it's sort of not within health services that we look at that. I'll tell you that we work very closely together with the family resource centers. I've had an incredible career in the sense that my colleagues from social work and other disciplines have taught me something that med school didn't teach me, in the sense that disease doesn't affect just an individual, it affects a whole family. So the whole family approach is something that within health services we do. We do a lot of couple counseling. We're doing research on conjoint therapy for PTSD. So we have an absolute interest in that. The publishing, the journals, the academics, we do look at the family impact as well. The specific question of resources for MFRCs, I can't answer that. Can't hear you.
I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that. After all these months of using Zoom, just where would we be able to follow up? Like, where could the committee follow up to get some of that specific information?
Ma'am, the MFRCs, they fall under morale and welfare. The morale and welfare, it's within Chief of Military Personnel, but I'll get back to you with the specific office. I mean, we're at meetings all the time, but they changed the name a little while ago of what they stand for. I think it's the morale and welfare.
Okay. Thank you so much. That's it for me, Chair.
All right. Thank you, Mr. McGregor. On to Madame Gallant, please.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and through you to Colonel Jetley. Does a suicidal CAF member have to call the hotline in person, or will the hotline respond if the spouse of a CAF member calls on behalf of the member in a crisis situation?
Do you mean the CIFMAP, the Canadian Forces Members Assistance Program?
I mean the hotline that if somebody is in extreme mental distress, they are instructed to call.
I understand. We don't have a hotline in that sense. We have a CIFMAP, which is the Canadian Forces Members Assistance Program, which isn't a suicide hotline. So if a suicide hotline is called, the community suicide hotline, which is, if there are some national ones, but they're different local, then they'll follow their own procedures.
Okay. How do the CAF members under your direction facilitate the seamless transition of care when patients release from the military to civilian life?
So there are many different sort of procedures in place, and part of it, and one of the big divisions, of course, will be, whether it's through Veterans Affairs, which a lot, if people have identified mental illness or mental injury that's attributable to military service, the really important thing that we've changed over the years is make sure that they have their assured Veterans Affairs paperwork, their eligibility, veterans card, all of those things in place prior to release. I think that's one of the most important things. We also do allow, and it's something that we almost encourage, if people know their intended place of release. One of your colleagues earlier said that people tend to release if you're in Borden, you might stay within the Barrie area. Then we will make that handover to Veterans Affairs, during the last 6 months. In Ottawa, we have a Veterans Affairs OSI clinic, and we have our own clinics. So if we can find a clinician and help make that transition smoother, then even while they're still in service, seeing sort of military family doctors and psychiatrists, if they find a therapist within the Veterans Affairs system. So I think the closing the gap between that, the transition is certainly an important piece. The transition group, the Canadian Armed Forces have just stood up specifically a group, an organization that's responsible for transition, and they would probably be able to answer the question better from a holistic sort of overall. But from a health perspective, the transition group will essentially attempt to make sure that people have ongoing health care, that they're connected to family physicians. It gets complicated often depending on where people elect to release from the military. They may move to a more remote community despite having health needs. So there are those challenges.
Okay, so the danger zone when people don't have that care is between their arriving home, needing that service, and care not already being in place. And that's when the deaths come. Now, back to that phone line. Okay, it's not a hotline, it's a member's assistance line. Are spouses or close family members, when they're transitioned, or their family member, be they in service or on transit on the way out, are they able to communicate with the family member? Will they act when a family member calls because the member is in crisis?
I can't answer that. I can look into and try to get you an answer, because we don't run SIFMAP. So I can certainly look into and try to give you an answer to that.
Would you please? I know that there are a number of members on this committee who are interested in the answer to that specific question. Yeah. And last week we had Dr. Serene as a witness, and I'm sure you're aware. They chair the expert panel on mental health. How many of the 11 recommendations have been fully implemented from that 2016 mental health report?
Of the 11, I can tell you the one that we didn't implement, the one that we looked very carefully, was the caring contacts, and we looked at it, and the science was sort of mixed on it, and the original setting of it was that. So that one we didn't do. In terms of the other one that's sort of in progress, I mean, you can read them out to me, and I can speak to them to you, because you're asking me to sort of remember the 11. But the sort of the office, the individual person responsible for suicide, that hiring process is going on right now. But we are between us sort of creating that function of the tracking and the implementation of sort of new approaches in the research. If you want to ask me about other specific ones, I can attempt to answer them.
No. So have there been any noticeable changes or trends in the mental health status of CAF members during this pandemic?
We don't have the literature on that right now, in terms of we just chaired a NATO meeting. We sort of co-chaired a NATO meeting on September 17th, and we sort of grabbed observations from all of our allies, and actually NATO plus Australia and New Zealand. And it seemed like most of our countries saw a drop in use within the first couple of months, and then sort of an increase in use. And it's I don't think we're going to have the exact numbers until later on when we look at things, because you've got sort of counterbalancing forces going on in the Canadian Armed Forces, in the sense that our members are fully employed. So a lot of the determinants of health are there, but they are sort of suffering from the same pandemic kind of thing. So there's some stressors that are the same as civilians, some stressors that are different. So we may have some protective factors and some risk factors. We haven't seen, in terms of an alarming increase in substance use, an alarming use in terms of family violence, although those are the kind of things that we're seeing in the civilian world that we're certainly tracking.
All right, thank you very much. Monsieur Robillard, s'il vous plaît.
Well, I'll ask right away, in case you leave a little later or a little earlier. You've spoken, and your colleagues have said the involvement of the near and dear ones, the extended family, father, mother, brother, brother-in-law. I've met with a lot of individuals who are, having some of these issues, and that the intervention is quite different, in fact, than what we have in theory. I've had all sorts of anecdotes I can report, but I'm trying to stem the gap, if you will, between yourself and these individuals as to what to do. if ever the extended family attempts to reach you or your establishment and are told no, that's not how it works, so it's not you're calling on the wrong position here. Yeah, he knows.
I'm sorry, I didn't really get the question. The translation was a little bit sketchy. I apologize, but if somebody could just summarize it for me, I'd appreciate that. If in fact it was directed to me.
You give me time to explain. I'll do it in English if you want. Okay. I was talking about the implication of relatives, people that are either father, mother, sister, brothers, that try to get involved to help the process and are refused. But that's not exactly what I heard from you and other colleagues of yours.
Yeah. So in terms of, I think again that's a very important point, and we do encourage members to include their families, but health conditions are private. So the if I have a health condition and my spouse asks my doctor about it, the doctor is not going to speak to them without my permission. So we encourage members to bring in their families. We encourage them to bring in their spouses. I think spouses give incredible what we call collateral information, and they can certainly help, and they can certainly be part of the treatment. If necessary, we'll do couples counseling, we'll do family counseling. The permission to allow other people to come in relies on the member. Now, if we get a phone call from a concerned family member that gives us information, we certainly will be on receive mode. We certainly will listen to the person respectfully and hear what they're saying and note it and document it and use it. We're just not, without permission, able to transmit and share the personal health information of an individual.
Thank you for that. Quelles sont les raisons?
Thank you for that. Why is there a difference between mental health problems among men and women in the armed forces? And this gap, is it due to a different approach adopted by the health protection management?
Is between male and female rates of mood, anxiety disorders, suicide attempts, addictions, those types of things are basically the same as they are in society. So there's biological differences between men and women, and that difference seems to carry itself into the armed forces.
Yeah. Do I have more time? I'll pass.
Thank you very much. Okay, Mr. Bazan, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank all our witnesses for participating again in our committee meeting, and apologize for the difficulties that we experienced on Monday. Colonel Jetley, again, congratulations. I've had the pleasure of working with you for almost a decade, and remember with fondness our travels across the country when I was parliamentary secretary, and trying to reach out to our troops dealing with their injuries and their illnesses and the supports that they're receiving from the Canadian Armed Forces. Some of those conversations were difficult, but I think we learned a lot from that. Now as you're looking at parting ways and moving into the private sector, when you look back on your 30 plus years as one of the lead psychiatrists, now for the at least last decade as the lead psychiatrist in the Canadian Armed Forces, I know that some of the early conversations we had was there wasn't even a clinical terminology around PTSD and what it encompassed and how it manifested itself. Can you talk to how mental health has changed from the standpoint of treatment and the science since in your time in service and to where we are today? And I know that we established the Center of Excellence at the Royal, helping both our current serving members and our veterans with dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder as well as other operational stress injuries. So I was just wondering if you could just talk about how things have changed in the last decade for sure, but over the course of your career.
Well, I could give an hour-long lecture on that, but thank you. I do
I'd
remember
probably
our
come and see
travels.
that.
I think in some ways, I think I pinch myself in terms of, I mean, deploying to Rwanda in the early 90s, where the mental health was sort of an afterthought. Like we didn't think we needed it, but I mean, people that went suffered, and of course, Romeo Dallaire and that whole story of, so, in one way, mental health was the poor cousin of healthcare. We were, and thankfully to the Canadian Armed Forces, the leadership, a few sort of broken souls along the way, the realization of mental health as being important and paramount, despite thousands of years of history, knowing that psychological injuries have always outnumbered physical injuries in war and in deployments, that whether World War I, World War II. I think that's the piece. I think the idea of, I think a watershed moment for us in the Canadian Armed Forces, and our allies are extremely envious of the way we sort of managed to create this whole operational stress injury paradigm. And what we've done is we've basically given it footing. Our sacrifice medal, which is like the Purple Heart, the American one, which doesn't recognize PTSD. If three members are in an IED and one person dies and one person loses two legs, the third person gets PTSD, all three receive the sacrifice medal. And if you understand the military, that sort of recognition and pinning something on is important. I think the whole OSI paradigm, I think, is important. I think more recently, this interest in understanding guilt, shame, anger, the whole moral injury concept, which may explain some of the suicide, may explain some of the resistance to conventional treatments, I think is really important. The two main things that we're going to continue to work on, which are the future, is understanding the biology, understanding what's happening in the brain, what's happening in the body, the inflammation, the heart disease, the diabetes that seems to be higher in people with mental illness, and why soldiers with PTSD die earlier than others. And I think the veterans, of course, cares about it. I think that's important. I think leveraging technology, I think understanding, using your Fitbit, your wearables, sort of getting into that point where we can, create sort of this 24/7 caring system using technology and things. And I think the whole idea of personalized medicine, I still think that that's important. We're getting there, but the idea of the trial and error is frustrating for doctors, it's frustrating for patients. So if we can sort of understand a little bit more which treatments are going to work for whom, and sort of start with the first one that we think is most likely going to work. So I think we've come an incredible way. I pinch myself. I remember, giving talks in Gagetown where it was almost like I was mocked in the, hey, it's time for the touchy-feely talk, to right now. I mean, nobody's laughing anymore at mental health. So I think we've come a long way, but it's a journey. I think there's a long way to continue to go. But I do believe that one of the other really important things is our engagement by looking up and out with the civilian community, and working with Bell and Bell Let's Talk and all the different things that we're doing, because I truly believe soldiers, like athletes, if we're able to talk about our own mental illness and our difficulties, I think that's important to kids. I think that's important to society. If we can do it, if the soldier can do it, the toughest guy that's out there can do it, why can't I if I'm an adolescent struggling? So I think we've come a long way.
So as we're coming that long way, are you seeing a major change in the culture? It used to be if you're feeling bad, you're weak.
I think it's that the change is so much. To be honest with you, I have to pinch myself. I mean, I've got leaders, here on this panel with me, and I've had the privilege of working with the Rear Admiral, and the way someone like the way she looks after her people. I mean, I just think it's, I mean, the calls that we get are about care of our people. People are saying, hey, what are we going to do? What's available for our people? So I just think that like people first is always kind of like a cliche almost within military settings, but I believe it's genuine. Like it's
So I know
All
that
right,
the
thank
leaders.
you. Thank you very much. I'll have to go to Mr. Robillard, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Madame. Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is for Rear Admiral Bernatchez and Colonel Rye. In a response given in this committee on October 23rd, 2018, it was said that only since that since 2000, only one member of the armed forces was found guilty under 98C. How do you explain this low number? Thank you for the question. I will attempt to answer. My colleague can complement my answer. As I said earlier to the committee, it is very difficult for us to explain how or why a legislative infraction is used or not. As I said, 70% of all charges brought forward in the justice military courts, or rather 70% of the infractions are basically the same infractions. So we don't know why it's always the same infractions that are pursued, but perhaps as regards 98.C, it has not been needed. We have not had to use it since 2000. It hasn't been necessary. I said during my testimony that between 1939 and 1945, during the Second World War, 98.C or its equivalent at the time had been used over 300 times. So maybe there's a correlation between combat or operational activity and the need to use this section. Another thing that was brought to my attention was that the military discipline code also has many other disciplinary infractions that are not used or underused. For example, the infraction of refusing a vaccine. Those are not brought forward regularly, which doesn't mean that they're not necessary. It just means that in this current moment, in this current context, at this particular time, it is not necessary. Well, what factors explain the higher suicide rates of the ground forces compared to other forces? Well, Dr. Jetley is a better place to answer this question, I believe.
Traditionally, most militaries, most of our allies, it's junior members of the army, sort of the combat arms in specifically. We did see an uptick in that group, which has sort of settled down in the last few months. And you can't absolutely clearly say it, but it also does reflect the people that are exposed most likely to the war, and they're in the trenches more. And when we have 2,700 people or so deployed to Afghanistan, the few hundred people that are part of the battle group that spend most of the time outside the wire are certainly created by those folks. There are other theories as well in terms of junior members of the Air Force tend to be more technical and tend to have different types of duties, and maybe different personalities are attracted. But certainly, if we're going to look at sort of the near past for most of our militaries and our allied militaries, the conflicts in Afghanistan, Iraq, and such can probably explain some of the difference. But association and causality are, of course, two different things.
Les tentatives faites par les
parliamentarians have tried to scrap 98C from the Act, but they haven't succeeded so far. Why do you think 98C has not been successfully scrapped? I shall presume that this question is for me. Yes, indeed. It is very difficult for me to answer this question since I'm not in Parliament and I don't sit on any committees. So perhaps your colleagues would be best placed to answer this question. But of course, I will be happy to continue supporting you in your debates and informing your decisions.
On to Monsieur Brunel-Duceppe, s'il vous plaît.
Pardon. Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is a really fascinating discussion today, and I'm very happy with the answers you've provided. As you know, there is a universality policy that requires that all members be able and ready to serve. Members can be freed from this for mental health reasons. So my question is for Professor Rotunda. First of all, I don't know if you mentioned this earlier, but is this also the case elsewhere in the world? Do other armies have this measure?
Process that our service members go through. So sometimes, depending on the level of disability, a service member might be separated with severance pay, a one-time payment. If they're significantly disabled, what we consider the threshold be more than 30% disabled, they can be separated with a disability retirement. So there are yes, sir, there are mechanisms to try and help service members get out of the services. You know,
mais ailleurs dans le monde, est-ce qu'on a...
And is this also the case elsewhere in the world?
I'm sorry, I don't know.
Peut-être qu'un des témoins pourrait...
Maybe another one of the witnesses knows whether this kind of clause exists elsewhere in the world?
Yes, something to that effect exists within most of our NATO countries. It applies to different degrees depending on the countries that have sort of obligatory service versus voluntary military, these kind of ideas. But ultimately, most defense forces, and it's not for mental illness, it's for physical illness, it's for lots of, it's for other things. And the concept, it is always in review, it's always in scrutiny within Canada in the sense of, you know, hey, is it the same thing to be deploying to, you know, a large base like Kandahar where you have a hospital and this versus a small village in Sierra Leone, and we talk about this. I will take advantage of saying to you, though, we have been taking a very progressive view as we're going further with mental illness. We're really emphasizing more and more, and I sit quarterly with my colleagues that are helping making these decisions of actually looking at people's functioning more than their diagnosis, right? So we really look to see, so if somebody has had 3 depressions, but they've only missed 3 or 4 days of work here and there, and they've been able to sail and they've been able to function, we're not sort of saying you can't serve in the military because you have this illness. So functioning, being able to continue to do their job safely, you know, we are encouraging, and the military is responsive to accepting a little bit more risk when it comes to illness if somebody is able to function with treatment. And
à ce moment-là, est-ce que vous êtes en mesure de... Non?
Sorry about that. Your time is up. Oh, damn it. I had such a great question.
Was that for me, Chair?
Yes, Mr.
Okay.
McGregor, sorry.
I actually have no further questions for our witnesses. I think I'll just end by thanking them all for their testimony and for being patient with us. Very much appreciated. So thank you.
Thank you. Would you like to give your time, Mr. Duceppe? Then you go carry on with the question. If that's all right with Mr. McGregor, that'd be fine.
Ça, c'est très gentil.
Thank you so much. Very kind of you. So my great question was the following, and it was this question is for the Rear Admiral. On average, how many Armed Forces members are separated for mental health issues? Do we have that kind of figure? Perhaps my colleague, Dr. Jetley, has this information, because we don't have that information on my side.
We do have, you know, the last I remember is about 5,000 people leave the military every year, and I think a third of them are for medical reasons. I don't know if we have the breakdown for mental illness, but we'll take that advisement. Right? We do have the numbers of people that are released. We have the numbers of people that are released for medical reasons, which are the so-called 3B releases. I don't know if we've gone through the exercise of separating by diagnosis. It gets complicated because many times people have more than one diagnosis. Right? So somebody could have chronic pain and PTSD and things.
Mais par contre, ça pourrait être intéressant pour nous de savoir, là, ça nous donnerait carrément...
Well, that could be interesting for us to know, though, because it probably would it'd be useful for us to have the exact number of people who are separated for mental health issues. So you'll provide this to the committee? Thank you.
Thank you very much. On to Mr. Bazan, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Monsieur Brunel, who's always asked good questions. So let's. I just want to get a clarification. Admiral Bernatchez, I believe that you, in answering some questions from earlier, you mentioned that if someone doesn't, or somebody refuses treatment, they can actually be charged under the National Defense Act or under the Code of Service Discipline.
I don't believe, sorry, I don't believe that this is what I meant or said.
Okay, it could have been in translation. Okay, so if somebody wanted to get or refuse to get treatment, whether it is for a physical injury, mental health injury, or vaccine, they wouldn't be charged under NDA, would they? Or disciplined?
So now I'm going to pass it over to my specialist in these type of granular data. I'm going to ask my colleague, Jill, to answer the committee.
Yes, thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir. There is no specific offense there's no specific obligation to undergo medical treatments. There is, I can say, an offense under the Code of Service Discipline for refusing immunization or vaccine. I'd have to tell you the exact
so you're
section.
telling me then that if somebody doesn't want to take the COVID-19 vaccine that's coming out right now, they can actually be disciplined for it?
That would only be a situation if they're actually ordered and it's an obligatory requirement. It's only if you are ordered to undertake immunization or a vaccine. I would have to find the exact wording to give you for that particular section.
Could you please provide that information? That would be interesting for us for sure, especially with some of the questions that are around efficacy at this point in time and safety of the vaccines at this point in time. So I know I'm taking the vaccine, but there might be others out there that don't want to. So I do appreciate that.
Yes.
I'm talking to you, both of you as Judge Advocate Generals. In the JAG office, one of your former colleagues, Colonel Jean-Guy Perron, testified when we were studying Bill C-77 back in November of 2018. We're looking at, whether or not 98C was a necessary segment underneath the Canadian Forces Act, that there is other ways to deal with those that malign themselves. And I think that, we heard from Professor Rotunda that in the United States that they have found other avenues to do it in. What other sections of the National Defense Act could those that use self-harm to avoid service, would we be able to charge them without a 98C?
So thank you for this question. We would have to do some analysis to see how to get there. But at the outset, what I would like to say is that tribunals generally prefer to have specific offenses, because when you have more general offenses to address a specific behavior, tribunals, courts in Canada will have a tendency to say, well, the accused did not get the opportunity to know exactly what they were facing. So I think that the capacity to charge under other offenses would require further analysis from my office. The fact that we currently have a specific offense that is incorporated in the Code of Service Discipline, if it was to disappear, could signal also to the courts the parliamentary intent in that regard.
So Admiral, if I can just stop you there, because we had at the hearing back in November 2018, when we were looking at the section underneath Bill C-77, Colonel Strachey at that point in time said that they were going to look at that issue of self-harm and other areas. So I would hope that, that was 2 years ago, that you would have had during the past 24 months time, or it's actually 25 months, to actually pull together that analysis.
And we have conducted a quite significant analysis since 2018, as we had committed to the committee at the time, and we've looked into it. And that's the answer that I'm providing to you. I'm saying that there could be second and third degrees of effect of repealing a specific offense within the Code of Service Discipline that could signal a parliament intent, and then trying then to charge a member under a more general offense For example, conduct to the prejudice of good order and discipline could be then seen by either my military tribunals or then civilian appeal courts as something that is no longer available to the military, which is something that I cannot positively declare at this point because a court would have to opine on this. So I'm just alerting the committee to the second and third order of effect that could happen if the specific offense was repealed from the Code of Service Discipline National Defense Act.
Okay, so the final question I have revolves around the board of internal or the boards of inquiry that take place, especially when it relates to suicide. And we already had Sheila Fines at committee, and of course her son committed suicide, Corporal Stuart Langridge. We all are also very familiar with the story of Lieutenant Shauna Rogers and how her family actually took CF to court in Alberta to get access to the BOI report. Now, has there become, this adds an insult to injury to families that are dealing with the loss of loved one due to suicide. Is there been any advancement on sharing those findings and making sure that they get all their questions answered surrounding the unfortunate event of suicide?
Yes, thank you for that question. And I am aware that those are concerns that have been shared with the committee. Unfortunately, this does not fall under my area of responsibility. It is something that would have to be addressed by the chain of command.
All right. Thank you very much. On to Mr. Spengman, please.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Rear Admiral Bernatchez, and to all the witnesses. Thank you very much for testifying this afternoon and your service to our country. And through you, I would like to thank the men and women who serve under your command.
On your pending retirement. And I wanted to take you back to conversations that were in previous rounds on the implications for serving in a combat role, either actively on the front lines of a kinetic environment or passively in a combat setting. We're seeing qualitatively and quantitatively different data out of that subset of members of the Canadian forces and many other forces around the world. Can you just zoom in a bit and give us a bit more descriptive content on what you're seeing and hearing and how these data are being analyzed and compared to other settings that the women and men serve in? Sorry, sir, you might be on mute. If you can just check your.
And I
Voilà.
apologize.
Okay,
I apologize
no
for that. Sorry. The evolution sort of mental illness. So we know there's been mental illness throughout the ages. I think that there's a particular there's the old saying of you're perfectly ready for the last war. So right now we've been analyzing this sort of insurgency, counterinsurgency battle, how it happens in small groups without the formed units, what impact that has in psychological. There's also the undeniable impact of physical injuries, concussions, and what the interaction between concussions and these things. So each mission tends to be different in the sense that we've gone, and I've been around long enough to go to the massive humanitarian crises versus the peacekeeping, which has unique stressors, the ability to not act sometimes and prevent things that are happening in front of your eyes, to out and out war, which is there. So each has a different, distinct flavor. I think that there was the peacekeeper syndrome, the rage that people felt sometimes in the peacekeeping era. There was the hopelessness, helplessness that a Rwanda can bring out in people. And I think with Afghanistan, we're seeing a mixture of both. We're seeing sort of sometimes the classic PTSD with sort of the anger, but we're also seeing the guilt, the shame, especially and sort of like a protracted grief because of the combat deaths that we saw at a frequency that as Canadians we're not used to seeing. So I think I'm not sure if that answers the question, but we try to do I always talk about we have these large studies that you're alluding to, and my colleagues have done them, and I love the studies. But at the end of the day, there's a person sitting across from you, 3 feet across from you that's suffering, and you have to actually address their experience. And so I think that we try not to assume what somebody's going to experience. but we do understand the unique qualities of asymmetric warfare. The enemy, in the case of the Taliban, had almost a mystique to them in the sense that all of a sudden they were there. I think the grief and loss of losing loved ones, colleagues, comrades, is certainly part of it there.
Colonel, thank you very much. In our previous session that was truncated for technological reasons, you made brief reference to, I think, along the lines of the concept of unawareness of unwellness.
Yes.
And I think that's a very important point. We know the resources that are available. In your assessment, is it still insufficiently based on a demand-based model? Do we need to do more to push the services into the lap of serving members, if that's the right phraseology?
I think we do. I think that, and again, I'm going to talk about mental illness care writ large across the world, more than picking on the Canadian Armed Forces. I think we've got a traditional model of face-to-face care. I'll see you every Tuesday at 9 o'clock for an hour, and a lot of that is an accident of how long it takes the Earth to spin on its axis and how long it takes the world to go around. Like if we're on another planet, it would be 30-hour sessions every year. And so I think that we can leverage technology. I think we can put into people's hands information, self-help, this kind, because I think that people have told us they don't have an illness, but they also resoundingly say in civilian society, militaries, I'd like to be able to handle things myself. So I think we need to really leverage technology and give people the tools, and they can come to us. They can say, hey, doc, I tried all that stuff, but it's not working. I think that would be the way of sort of giving it that 24/7 kind of way of approach as well.
Maybe very briefly, if I've got a few seconds, are there any considerations with respect to proof of injury that the committee should be aware of on the part of a serving Canadian Forces member who is suffering a mental injury?
We have not gone that route, and it's something that I've fought against. I know our U.S. colleagues had that at some point, and I was fortunate enough to treat a Vietnam vet years ago. So I think the fog of war happens. One of my slides, in fact, that I do in my lectures is I show somebody seeing a child die in their arms, but then I see everybody else going on their business, and that would be the person that 5 years later somebody would say, I was there, I didn't see that happen. So we haven't gone that route. I think we certainly easily can verify somebody being at a mission. We can verify somebody being there. There's a consistency in their presentation. Can we sit and always identify whether there was a Jeep accident on that date during a war? We can't. So as far as I know, we haven't done that. And Veterans Affairs is diagnosis based, not incident based. For sacrifice medals and for certain type of things, we do look for sort of more facts regarding the event itself, whether it was hostile enemy action. That's more of a bureaucratic awarding of medals, but it's not a care issue.
Thank you, sir. It's extremely helpful. Thank you.
Yep. Very good. Well, that brings our question session to an end. And I would like to say to the witnesses how grateful we are for your time that you took and you stuck with us. You persevered through our first meeting and joined us again today. And I just wanted to let you know that some of the information that you shared with us today is absolutely fundamental to our study. And I learned a great deal, and I think the other members of the committee learned a great deal, and we really appreciate it. And we wanted to, so thank you for the committee. I appreciate the interest in this topic, how important it is to our men and women in uniform who serve us so well every day. So with that, I would like to say thank you again to all our witnesses, tous nos témoins. I wish you all a very happy holiday season, whether you celebrate Christmas or Hanukkah or what. We all are going to need this year, some light. It's at the end of 2020, it's certainly been a challenge. So I appreciate all of your work for the members of the committee and our witnesses. I wish you a very safe and happy holiday season. And thank you very much. And with that, we are adjourned.
Thank you.